The wind cut through skin like ice razors when Dr. Sarah Chen stepped out of the helicopter, her boots sinking into the packed snow on the shore of Crystal Lake. The pilot shouted something about worsening weather, but his words were lost in the roar of rotor blades. Sarah waved, signaling she understood, and watched the aircraft pull away, becoming just a dot against Colorado's gray sky. 37 years. That's how long Flight 447 of Mountain Airways had remained at the bottom of these frozen waters, taking with it 47 lives and, possibly, the truth about what really happened that October night in 1987. Sarah adjusted her backpack and walked toward the base camp her team had set up the day before. 2 military green tents, technical diving equipment stacked under tarps, and a diesel generator humming quietly, powering portable computers and communication systems. As she approached, she heard voices coming from the larger tent. "I'm not saying it's impossible, Rodriguez. I'm saying it's dangerous as hell." The rough, irritated voice belonged to Marcus Thompson, a technical diving veteran she'd hired after 3 other professional divers refused the job. At 62, Marcus had the lean, wiry body of someone who'd spent decades fighting underwater currents. His hands, always trembling from what he called Mekong ghosts, were paradoxically steady when touching diving equipment. Sarah unzipped the tent and entered, immediately hit by the contrast between the cutting cold outside and the stuffy warmth inside. Marcus was hunched over an improvised table, studying nautical charts and dive plans. Across from him, Detective Lisa Rodriguez, officially retired 2 years ago but obsessive about this specific case, typed furiously on her laptop, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside the keyboard. "Problems, gentlemen?" Sarah asked, removing her gloves and blowing on her hands to warm them. Marcus looked up, and Sarah noticed the deep circles under his eyes that seemed to have intensified since he'd arrived 2 days earlier. "Water temperature is 3 degrees below expected. 16 below zero at surface, probably 22 at the bottom. We'll need state-of-the-art dry suits and heating systems. 20 more minutes of decompression." "We have equipment for that," Sarah said, removing her heavy coat. "And you have experience with colder waters in Alaska." "In Alaska, I didn't have an obsessed investigator pressuring me to take unnecessary risks," Marcus grumbled, shooting an irritated look at Rodriguez. Lisa stopped typing and turned in her folding chair. 37 years, Thompson. 37 years this case has remained open because we could never reach the wreckage. 3 families still don't know what really happened to their relatives that night. And 3 more families will be without answers if we die down there," Marcus retorted. Sarah sat in the 3rd chair, forming a tense triangle. As a forensic investigator with 15 years of experience, she'd mediated enough conflicts between strong personalities to recognize when tension was about to explode. "Let's go to the facts," she said, pulling out a file folder. "Lisa, tell me again why this case is so important to you." Rodriguez sighed, closing the laptop. At 49, she maintained the rigid posture of a career police officer, but Sarah noticed her hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from excessive caffeine and probably lack of sleep. October 1987. I was 19, studying criminology at the University of Colorado. Flight 447 disappeared during a snowstorm, carrying executives from Evergreen Development Corporation returning from a meeting in Aspen. "Meeting about what?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Officially, development of a new ski resort. But in the days following the accident, 3 state politicians resigned without explanation. The mayor of Boulder died in a car accident 2 weeks later, and Evergreen mysteriously canceled the resort project, losing $50 million in investments." Marcus snorted. "Conspiracy theories. You women watch too many TV movies." The look Rodriguez shot him could have frozen the lake itself. "It's not theory when you have documents, Thompson. 3 years ago, when I retired, I finally got access to the sealed case files. The meeting in Aspen wasn't about resorts. It was about a development project that required the forced relocation of an entire indigenous community. Land that supposedly had no value, but which a confidential geological report showed contained massive uranium deposits. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Are you suggesting the accident was intentional? I'm suggesting that very powerful people had a lot to lose if that meeting came to light, and that it's worth diving in freezing water to discover the truth. Marcus stood abruptly, making the table shake. Shit, you two are talking about murder, multiple murder. And if you're right, then the same people who supposedly brought down a plane won't hesitate to silence 3 curious divers. That's why we hired you, Sarah said calmly. Because you don't intimidate easily. Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Dr. Chen, I survived 3 tours in Vietnam, dove in shipwrecks full of decomposing bodies, and pulled more corpses from water than I can count. But this is different. If you're right, we're messing with people who have resources to make any one of us disappear. Which is why we document everything and send copies to multiple sources before going down, Rodriguez said, returning to the laptop. I've already sent all files to 3 different journalists and my lawyer. If something happens to us, the story comes out automatically. Sarah watched Marcus process this information, seeing the conflict in his tired eyes. She knew he needed the money. His daughter was in college, and military pension didn't cover the bills. But she also knew he was haunted by nightmares of dead teammates in Southeast Asia, and the prospect of more deaths terrified him. What's the exact depth? He asked finally. Sarah consulted her notes. Sonar indicates the wreckage is at 180 meters, wedged on a rocky ledge on the lake's north wall. Bottom time? 17 minutes of effective work, considering trimix mixture and mandatory decompression stops. Marcus nodded slowly. And if we find evidence, what exactly are we looking for? Rodriguez perked up. The black box was recovered, but it was damaged, and recordings were inconclusive. We're looking for documents, briefcases, anything that might have survived in the cold. Specifically, Evergreen's CEO, James Morrison, was carrying a leather briefcase that his secretary described as extremely sensitive documents. After 37 years at the bottom of a lake, Marcus shook his head, paper turns to pulp, leather rots. Not at these temperatures, Sarah intervened. Similar cases have shown that documents can preserve remarkably well in water near freezing, especially if they were in partially sealed containers. 3 hours later, they were at the lake's edge, checking equipment for the last time. The wind had diminished, but the sky remained threatening, promising more snow before nightfall. Sarah put on the 7mm neoprene dry suit, feeling the thermal insulation layers adjust to her body. The electric heating system was working perfectly, maintaining body temperature even before entering the water. Marcus tested the regulators for the 3rd time, his obsession with equipment being both a blessing and a curse. Communication via umbilical cable every 5 minutes, he said, adjusting the underwater radio system. Any problem, any strange feeling, we abort immediately. Rodriguez, who had insisted on making the dive despite her limited certification, struggled with her fins. I've never dived this deep, she admitted. Then why the hell do you insist on going down? Marcus asked, exasperated. Because I spent 28 years of my life as a cop, and I learned that if you want something done right, you do it yourself. Sarah made final adjustments to her underwater camera and LED lighting system. The plan was simple. Controlled descent following the rock wall, locating wreckage using GPS coordinates, extensive photographic documentation, and focused search for preserved documents or personal objects. Remember, she said, putting on her mask, we don't touch anything until we document the original position. We treat this as a crime scene, not as a recreational dive. The water was colder than expected. Even with the thermal suit, Sarah felt the initial shock when she submerged. Visibility was surprisingly good, about 15 meters, thanks to the low temperature that inhibited algae growth. Communication test, Marcus's voice crackled in the underwater earphone. Sarah, clear and audible. Rodriguez, 5 by 5. Descending to 40 meters. First equalization stop. The world above the surface quickly disappeared, replaced by the blue-gray silence of the depths. Sarah watched the depth gauge. 45 meters, 50, 60. The lake's rocky walls became steeper, more dramatic. Occasionally, trout passed like pale ghosts. At 120 meters, Marcus signaled a stop. Equipment and conditions check. How do you feel? Sarah checked her instruments. Tank pressure good, gas mixture optimal, body temperature stable. Everything normal here. Rodriguez' status? There was a longer pause. I feel a little nauseous, but I can continue. Nitrogen narcosis, Marcus explained. Normal at this depth. If it gets worse, you surface immediately. They continued the descent. At 150 meters, sunlight was just a distant memory, and their powerful LEDs created cones of light that revealed the rough textures of submerged rock. The pressure was immense, more than 15 atmospheres compressing their bodies. Visual contact, Sarah said, her voice barely containing excitement. On the rocky ledge below them, partially covered by decades of sediment, was the unmistakable silhouette of a commercial aircraft. The Mountain Airways. Boeing 737-200 was surprisingly intact, as if it had been carefully placed there instead of suffering a violent accident. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez murmured. It's almost perfect. Marcus swam in wide circles around the wreckage, his military experience evident in the systematic way he assessed the scene. This doesn't look like a typical accident, he said finally. Where's the impact damage? The fuselage should be crushed. Sarah began photographing, documenting every angle. The aircraft's tail was slightly bent, but the wings remained attached. Stranger still, the passenger windows were intact. It's like it landed in the water and sank instead of crashing. Shit, Rodriguez said, her voice tense. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Sarah followed Rodriguez's light beam to the fuselage's side. There, clearly visible despite 3 decades underwater, were 3 perfectly circular holes in the metal, each about the size of a quarter. Bullet holes, Marcus said quietly. Someone shot this plane. Before or after it hit the water? Sarah asked, though she knew the answer would change everything. By the corrosion pattern, definitely before. These marks are from the original impact. Rodriguez was photographing furiously. We need to get inside. We need to see the bodies. Look for evidence. Easy, Marcus said. First we check the structural hull, look for safe entry points. We don't want to cause a collapse and get trapped inside. They spent the next 10 minutes circling the aircraft, documenting damage and looking for openings. The main passenger door was partially open, probably due to water pressure during sinking. Marcus tested the structure around the opening. Seems stable, but we enter one at a time and nobody stays inside for more than 5 minutes. Sarah went first. She swam carefully through the opening, her heart beating hard when her lights illuminated the airplane's interior. The seats were still aligned in orderly rows, and in each one of them. My God, she whispered. The passengers were still seated, preserved by the extreme cold like frozen mummies. Men in suits, women in 80s executive clothing. Their faces were discolored but recognizable, expressions of surprise and terror frozen for eternity. Sarah, status? Marcus's voice sounded distant. 47 bodies still in seats, remarkable preservation. She forced herself to maintain professional tone, but her stomach churned. Looking for first class. She swam toward the front of the cabin, where evergreen executives would have been seated. In the 3rd row, she found a middle-aged man with a black leather briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. The identification on his collar read, J. Morrison, CEO. Found Morrison and the briefcase, she reported. The handcuffs suggest he considered the documents extremely valuable. Can you remove the briefcase without disturbing the body? Sarah examined the handcuffs. They were heavy metal, but 3 decades in freezing water had weakened the mechanism. Carefully, she manipulated the lock until it opened with a soft click. The briefcase was heavy, sealed with a combination lock. Sarah placed it in her equipment bag and began swimming back toward the exit. That's when she saw the other bullet marks. On the cabin's inner wall, a line of holes showed the trajectory of projectiles that had crossed the fuselage from side to side. But these were different. They came from inside the plane, not from outside. "Marcus, Rodriguez," she said, her voice tense. "We have a bigger problem." "What did you find?" "Evidence of internal gunfire. Someone fired from inside the cabin outward." There was silence on the communication channel for several seconds. "Sarah," Marcus said finally, "get out of there. Now." She didn't argue. Swimming quickly toward the exit, she noticed something she'd missed on entry. Drops of blood preserved in ice that had formed at the plane's door. Blood that, by its position, could only have come from someone exiting the aircraft, not entering. When she emerged from the wreckage, she found Marcus and Rodriguez waiting with tense expressions. "Report," Marcus said. "James Morrison was handcuffed to the briefcase, and there's evidence that at least one person survived the initial impact and tried to exit the plane." "How can you be sure?" "Because there's a blood trail leading from the door to the rock wall. And," Sarah paused, checking her underwater notes, "there's oxygen in some of the aircraft's emergency tanks. Someone used them." Rodriguez moved nervously in the water. "So we have a survivor who witnessed what really happened. Or we have the killer who made sure there were no survivors," Marcus said grimly. Sarah was about to respond when her underwater light caught something on the rocky ledge above the wreckage. A dark opening in the cliff wall, partially hidden by algae growth, large enough for a person to swim through. "There's a cave up there," she said, pointing. Marcus followed her gaze. "Shit! I bet that's where our survivor went." "Remaining airtime?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah checked her gauges. 8 minutes bottom time, then mandatory decompression. "Enough for a quick look at the cave?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Quick. 2 minutes maximum." They swam to the rocky opening. The cave extended about 10 meters before curving out of sight. But in the first few meters, Sarah's lights revealed something that made her blood freeze. Clothes, modern ones, not from the 80s. A professional diving jacket, breathing equipment, and a pistol still in its waterproof holster. "Someone else has been here," Rodriguez said, her voice barely disguising panic. "Recently." Marcus was examining the diving equipment. "This regulator is state-of-the-art, manufactured in the last 5 years." Sarah quickly photographed everything, her heart beating fast. "We need to get out. Now." "Agreed." We surface, process what we found, and then decide the next step. They began the slow, controlled ascent, making mandatory decompression stops. During the long minutes of waiting at different depths, none of them spoke. Each processed the implications of what they'd discovered. When they finally surfaced at the lake's surface, the sun was setting, tinting the water blood red. Sarah swam to the diving platform they'd set up and hauled herself out of the water, her muscles protesting against the effort and cold. "The briefcase," Rodriguez said as soon as she removed her mask. "We need to open the briefcase." Sarah placed it carefully on a folding table, still dripping freezing water from the lake. The combination lock was corroded, but functional. "Anyone have ideas for the combination?" Marcus examined the numbers. "Try Morrison's birth date, or maybe—" The lock opened with a click. "It was unlocked," Sarah said, frowning. "After 37 years in water, it was unlocked." Inside the briefcase, protected by a sealed plastic envelope, were documents that changed everything. Contracts, geological reports, and correspondence between James Morrison and at least 6 state politicians. But not about resort development. "Jesus," Rodriguez murmured, reading over Sarah's shoulder. Uranium mining. They were planning to displace 3,000 people from their ancestral lands to extract uranium. And look at this, Sarah said, pointing to a letter dated 2 days before the accident. Morrison was having second thoughts. He wanted to cancel the project. Marcus read the document aloud. The forced relocation of this community is not only morally repugnant, but legally questionable. I am withdrawing Evergreen Corporation's support and urge all partners to do the same. Profits don't justify the destruction of an entire culture. And here, Rodriguez added, holding another sheet, a response from Senator William Hayes. Mr. Morrison, you are making a mistake that may cost much more than money. Some decisions cannot be undone. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. That's a direct threat. And 3 days later, Morrison's plane is at the bottom of the lake with bullet holes, Marcus said. Rodriguez was quickly flipping through the other documents. There's more. Offshore bank accounts, payments to private security companies, and... She stopped, her face paling. There's a list of potential problems that needed to be resolved. What kind of problems? Investigative journalists, indigenous rights activists, and any politician who opposed the project. Rodriguez swallowed hard. 12 names on the list. 7 of them died in accidents in the 6 months following the plane crash. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of an approaching engine. All 3 turned to see a fishing boat heading toward their platform, cutting through the lake's calm water. "Are we expecting company?" Marcus asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the dive knife on his belt. "No," Sarah said, quickly putting the documents back in the briefcase. "And fishing boats don't normally operate at night." The boat stopped about 50 meters away. 3 men in dark suits stood at the stern, clearly not fishermen. One of them raised something to his mouth, a radio or satellite phone. "Shit," Rodriguez murmured. "How did they know we were here?" Sarah looked at their team's communication equipment, a horrible realization forming. "Marcus, you said you tested all radios before we went down." "Of course I did." "Why?" "Because if someone was monitoring emergency diving frequencies..." Sarah didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication was clear. The boat began moving again, this time directly toward them. In the growing darkness, Sarah could see that the men weren't fishermen. They were professionals, and they were armed. "We have a problem," Marcus said, beginning to collect essential equipment. "A very big problem." Rodriguez was furiously packing the documents. "How many copies did you say you sent to journalists?" 3, but that was before we found Morrison's briefcase. So they don't know what we really discovered," Sarah said, an idea forming. "We still have the advantage." The boat was now only 30 meters away, and Sarah could hear male voices discussing something. One of them sounded familiar, though she couldn't identify from where. Marcus checked his diving equipment. "We can go back in the water, try to reach the opposite shore." "Not without losing the documents," Rodriguez said. "And without the documents, 47 people died for nothing." The boat's engine slowed. An amplified voice echoed over the water. "Dr. Chen, Detective Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, please keep your hands visible and don't make sudden movements." Sarah exchanged glances with her companions. How did they know their names? "You made a remarkable discovery today," the voice continued. "We'd like to discuss the next steps." "And if we don't want to discuss?" Rodriguez shouted back. There was laughter from the boat. "Detective, you spent 28 years enforcing the law. Surely you understand the difference between a request and an order." A powerful searchlight beam hit them, momentarily blinding them. When Sarah's vision adjusted, she saw there were more boats approaching from different directions. They were being surrounded. "Dr. Chen," the voice said, now clearly recognizable as belonging to an older man, "your reputation as a forensic investigator is impeccable. I'm sure you can appreciate the complexity of the situation you discovered today." Sarah shielded her eyes from the intense light. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been waiting for this conversation for a long time. Someone who can offer answers to questions you don't even know you should ask. Marcus whispered urgently, "Whatever we do it together. Nobody separates." The main boat approached until it was almost touching the platform. A man of about 70, with impeccably combed grey hair and wearing an expensive wool coat, climbed onto the platform. Two younger men followed him, their hands casually resting on weapons concealed under their jackets. "Dr. Chen," the older man said, extending his hand as if they were at a social gathering. "Senator William Hayes, retired. I believe you just read some of my old correspondence." Sarah didn't shake the extended hand. "You were supposed to be dead. Died of a heart attack in 1994. Hayes smiled. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain said. Sometimes a man needs to die officially to continue living." Rodriguez stepped forward, her police posture still evident even in retirement. "You ordered the murder of 47 innocent people." "Detective Rodriguez," Hayes said, his tone remaining conversational, "during your years of service, how many times did you have to make difficult decisions for the greater good? How many times did you sacrifice the individual for the collective?" "I never murdered innocent passengers on a plane." "No? What about that shooting in 2003? The young man with mental problems you shot because he was threatening a school full of children?" Hayes had done his research. One life to save hundreds. Not very different. Rodriguez paled but held her ground. That was completely different. It was a matter of scale, nothing more. Hayes turned to Sarah. "Dr. Chen, you're a scientist. You understand cost-benefit. The mining project that James Morrison wanted to cancel would have provided enough uranium to power clean nuclear reactors for decades. Energy that could have reduced carbon emissions and saved the planet from catastrophic climate change. At the cost of displacing thousands of people from their ancestral lands," Sarah retorted. 3,000 people to potentially save millions. Morrison was an idealist who couldn't see the bigger picture. Marcus spat in the water. "Pretty words for mass murder." Hayes finally showed irritation. "Mr. Thompson, you served in Vietnam. How many innocent Vietnamese died to supposedly save the world from communism? War always produces collateral damage. This wasn't war. It was greed. It was necessity," Hayes corrected, "and it continues to be." Sarah felt a cold understanding forming. "You're not here to silence us. You're here to recruit us." "Very good, Doctor. You discovered the truth about Flight 447, but you also discovered something more important, that some people are willing to make difficult decisions when necessary." Hayes gestured to the documents. "The uranium project never died. It was just postponed. And with climate change accelerating, it's become more critical than ever." Rodriguez shook her head. "You're insane if you think we're going to help you finish what you started in 1987. Detective, do you really think this is the first time divers have discovered this wreckage?" Hayes smiled coldly. "Do you think that modern equipment in the cave got there by chance?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "How many other teams?" 4 in the last 15 years. All made the smart choice and joined the project. All are living comfortably today, with their families safe. And those who didn't make the smart choice. Hayes didn't answer, but his silence was eloquent. Marcus was slowly moving his hand toward his dive knife when a new voice cut through the night air. "That's enough, William." Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. A woman in her 50s, wearing a military-style jacket, stood on the bow of one of the other boats. Even in the searchlight's glare, Sarah could see the family resemblance immediately. "Rachel Morrison," the woman said, stepping onto the platform with fluid grace. "James Morrison was my father." Hayes's composed expression cracked for the first time. "Rachel, I thought you were dead, like my father?" Rachel's voice carried decades of controlled rage. "No, William, I've been very much alive, and I've been waiting 37 years for this moment." She looked at Sarah, Marcus, and Rodriguez. "My apologies for the dramatic entrance, but when my surveillance team reported you'd found the wreckage, I knew William wouldn't be far behind. She gestured to Hayes and his men. He's been monitoring diving activity on this lake for decades, eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. Hayes recovered his composure. Rachel, you don't understand the complexities. I understand that you murdered my father because he grew a conscience. Rachel pulled out a waterproof tablet and activated it. I also understand that you've been continuing his work under different names, different corporations, but with the same goal, stealing indigenous land for uranium mining. The tablet's screen showed satellite images, financial records, and what appeared to be current mining operations. 3 active sites in Nevada, 2 in Arizona, and 1 in New Mexico. All on land taken from Native American communities through legal manipulation and intimidation. Rodriguez stepped closer to see the screen. You have evidence of ongoing operations? 23 years worth. I've been building a case against William and his network since I graduated law school. Rachel's smile was sharp as a blade. Corporate law, specializing in environmental crimes. Turns out it's very useful when you're hunting the people who killed your family. Hayes signaled to his men, and Sarah saw them slowly reaching for their weapons. Rachel, you're making the same mistake your father made. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. No, William, I'm letting justice guide my actions. Rachel touched something on her tablet. As of 5 minutes ago, every document on this device has been uploaded to servers in 12 different countries. FBI, EPA, International Criminal Court, and about 30 news organizations. The sound of additional boat engines filled the night air. Sarah counted at least 6 new vessels approaching, these bearing the distinctive markings of federal law enforcement. Dr. Chen, Rachel said, I apologize for involving you in this family drama, but your discovery today provides the final piece of evidence we needed. Forensic proof that Flight 447 was deliberately brought down. Hayes was backing toward his boat, his composed mask finally slipping. You have no idea what you're destroying, Rachel. The uranium project was never about clean energy, Rachel interrupted. It was about making you and your partners billionaires while destroying indigenous communities, just like it was in 1987. The federal boats were close enough now that Sarah could see agents in tactical gear preparing to board. Hayes's men looked uncertainly between their employer and the approaching law enforcement. William Hayes, a voice boomed from the lead federal boat, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, terrorism, and violation of federal environmental protection statutes. Hayes looked at Sarah one last time. Dr. Chen, you have no idea what forces you've set in motion. This goes far beyond one old man's mistakes. As federal agents swarmed the platform, arresting Hayes and his men, Rachel Morrison approached Sarah, Marcus, and Rodriguez. I know this has been overwhelming, she said, but I need you to understand something crucial. William was telling the truth about one thing. This conspiracy goes much deeper than just him. She showed them another screen on her tablet. The uranium mining network involves current members of Congress, Fortune 500 corporations, and international mining conglomerates. Arresting William is just the beginning. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. That's why you needed the briefcase. It contains the original evidence linking all the players. Exactly. My father was the one honest man in the group. When he threatened to expose the conspiracy, they had to silence him. But he was smart. He documented everything. Rodriguez was studying the arrest operation with professional interest. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I graduated law school and swore I'd get justice for my father. 23 years of building cases, following money trails, and waiting for someone to finally reach the wreckage. Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. What happens now? Rachel's expression grew serious. Now the real work begins. We have evidence of one conspiracy, but we need to trace all the connections, identify all the players, and make sure this can never happen again. She paused, looking out over the dark water where her father had died. And we need to make sure the families of those 47 victims finally get the truth they've been waiting for. As the federal agents finished their arrests and began securing the scene, Sarah realized that finding the wreckage had been only the beginning. The real investigation into decades of corruption, murder, and environmental destruction was just starting. But something in Rachel Morrison's determined expression told her that this time justice might actually prevail. The FBI field office in Denver buzzed with activity at 2 a.m., fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across cluttered desks and evidence boards. Sarah Chen sat in a metal chair that squeaked every time she moved, nursing her fourth cup of coffee while watching federal agents catalog the evidence they'd recovered from Crystal Lake. Across the room, Marcus Thompson paced like a caged animal, his military training evident in the precise way he turned at each corner. The events of the evening had triggered something in him. Sarah could see it in the way his hands shook more than usual, the way his eyes darted to exits and shadows. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had claimed a corner desk and spread out copies of the documents from Morrison's briefcase, cross-referencing names and dates with her own research files. Even after 37 years, her police instincts were sharp as ever. "Dr. Chen?" A young FBI agent approached with a tablet. "Agent Martinez wants to debrief you separately. Room 3. Sarah followed the agent down a hallway, lined with portraits of former FBI directors. Room 3 was sterile and windowless, containing only a metal table, 2 chairs, and a recording device. Agent Maria Martinez was already seated, reviewing a thick file. "Dr. Chen, thank you for your patience." Martinez was perhaps 40, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back severely. "I need to understand exactly what you found down there, and why Rachel Morrison was so interested in your specific dive." Sarah settled into the uncomfortable chair. "How much do you know about Rachel's investigation?" "More than I'd like to admit. She's been feeding us information for 3 years, building cases against what she calls the Uranium Consortium. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of her work." "Supposed to be?" Martinez leaned forward. "Dr. Chen, arresting William Hayes was the easy part. He's 73 years old, officially dead for 30 years, and frankly, not the real power behind this operation anymore." Sarah felt a chill. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that while you were pulling a briefcase out of a crashed airplane, the current leadership of the consortium was implementing damage control protocols that we've been tracking for years." Martinez opened her file. "Within 6 hours of your dive, 3 witnesses in ongoing federal cases disappeared. 2 journalists investigating uranium mining on tribal lands received death threats, and 50 million was transferred through shell companies to accounts we can't trace. They knew we were coming. They've known about every dive attempt on that lake for 15 years. Rachel thinks Hayes was using the surveillance to eliminate threats, but our analysis suggests he was just the cleanup crew. The real decision-makers have been several steps ahead the entire time." Martinez turned her tablet towards Sarah, showing a complex organizational chart. "The Uranium Consortium, as it exists today, involves sitting senators, defense contractors, international mining companies, and at least 3 Fortune 500 corporations. Hayes was middle management." Sarah studied the chart, recognizing several prominent names. "How is this possible? How do you hide a conspiracy this large?" "You don't hide it. You legalize it." Martinez pulled up another document. "In the last 20 years, lobbying efforts by consortium members have resulted in legislation that makes it easier to claim indigenous lands for national security purposes. Mining permits that used to take years now get approved in months. Environmental impact studies get waived for critical minerals. So they don't need to crash airplanes anymore." "Exactly. They've made murder unnecessary by making theft legal." A knock interrupted them. Another agent entered and whispered something to Martinez, whose expression darkened. "Dr. Chen, we need to move you to a secure location." Now, what's wrong? Rachel Morrison's law office was firebombed 20 minutes ago. No casualties, but all her physical files were destroyed. Sarah's blood chilled. Her digital backups? That's what we're trying to determine. But if they've been compromised... Martinez didn't finish the sentence. They moved quickly through the FBI building's corridors. Sarah was reunited with Marcus and Rodriguez in an underground parking garage where black SUVs waited with engines running. "What the hell is happening?" Marcus demanded as agents ushered them into vehicles. "Damage control," Rodriguez said grimly. "Someone's trying to bury this before it gets bigger." As their SUV pulled out into Denver's empty streets, Sarah saw Rachel Morrison for the first time since the lake. She was in the lead vehicle, talking animatedly into a secure phone. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in her posture. The safe house was a nondescript ranch home in a suburban neighborhood south of the city. Inside, it was clearly a federal facility. Reinforced windows, multiple communication systems, and enough computer equipment to run a small intelligence operation. Rachel was already there when they arrived, surrounded by laptops and tablets, her law enforcement contacts working to rebuild her destroyed files from digital sources. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked. Rachel looked up, and Sarah saw exhaustion that went beyond the late hour. "Worse than I expected. They didn't just destroy my office, they've been systematically targeting my sources for the last 6 hours. She pulled up a news feed on one of the screens. "Dr. Patricia Whitehorse, tribal historian, and my primary source on land seizures in Nevada. Car accident 3 hours ago. Still alive, but in intensive care. Professor David Kim at Stanford, who was documenting environmental damage from illegal mining. His research lab was burglarized, all his data stolen." Marcus slumped into a chair. "How many people are we talking about?" 12 sources across 6 states. 8 have been threatened, intimidated, or attacked since your dive ended." Rachel's fingers flew across her keyboard. "But here's what's interesting. They're not trying to kill everyone. They're trying to discredit the information." She showed them a series of news articles that had appeared online in the last few hours. "Environmental activist fabricates mining evidence. Tribal leaders' financial ties to anti-corporate groups exposed. University professor under investigation for research fraud." Rodriguez studied the articles with professional skepticism. "Coordinated disinformation campaign. Someone with serious media resources. And serious political connections," Sarah added, noticing the bylines. "These aren't tabloid reporters. These are writers from major newspapers." Agent Martinez joined them, carrying fresh coffee and grim news. "We've identified the source of the attack articles. They're being pushed by Meridian Communications, a public relations firm that specializes in crisis management for major corporations." "Let me guess," Rachel said bitterly. "Meridian has corporate clients in the mining industry. 3 of the largest uranium mining companies in North America, including one that's been trying to acquire drilling rights on tribal lands in Colorado for the last 5 years." Sarah felt the pieces clicking together. The same lands that Morrison's original consortium was targeting in 1987. Bingo. The project never died. It just evolved. Instead of one massive land grab, they've been acquiring smaller parcels over decades, using legal pressure, economic coercion, and when necessary, intimidation. Rachel pulled up a map showing mining claims across the western United States. "Look at this pattern. Systematic acquisition of land with uranium deposits, always targeting communities with limited political power." The map was devastating in its scope. Hundreds of small mining operations, many on or adjacent to tribal lands, all connected through a web of subsidiary corporations and shell companies. "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "This isn't just about one conspiracy. It's about the systematic destruction of indigenous communities for corporate profit. And it's been going on for 37 years, Rodriguez added. Since before the internet, before modern surveillance technology, before anyone was really paying attention to corporate malfeasance on this scale." Agent Martinez's phone buzzed. She answered, listened for a moment, then hung up with a troubled expression. "We have a problem. William Hayes posted bail an hour ago." "How is that possible?" Sarah asked. "He's supposed to be dead." Apparently, his death was never officially processed through federal databases. As far as the legal system knows, he's a 73-year-old man with no criminal record who's been living quietly in Montana for the last 30 years. Rachel laughed bitterly. Of course, they've had decades to create perfect cover identities. It gets worse. His legal representation is Morrison, Klein and Associates, one of the most powerful corporate law firms in the country. They're claiming Hayes is a victim of mistaken identity and demanding all evidence be turned over for independent analysis. "They're going to bury this in litigation," Rodriguez predicted. "Tie it up in courts for years while the real perpetrators destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses." Sarah stood up abruptly, a realization hitting her. "Wait! We're thinking about this wrong." Everyone turned to look at her. "They're not trying to hide the conspiracy anymore. They're trying to control the narrative. The firebombing, the media attacks, the legal challenges. It's all designed to make us look like conspiracy theorists, while they position themselves as victims of environmental extremists." Rachel nodded slowly. "A classic corporate defense strategy. When you can't deny the facts, you attack the credibility of the people presenting them." Which means," Sarah continued, "they're not afraid of what we found in the lake. They're afraid of what we might find next." Martinez leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Morrison's briefcase contained evidence of one conspiracy from 1987. But what if there are other crash sites, other incidents where people got too close to the truth?" Rachel's eyes widened. "You think they've done this before?" "I think they've been doing this for decades. Aircraft accidents, car crashes, industrial accidents, anytime someone threatened to expose the operation." Marcus was already pulling up databases on one of the computers. How many environmental activists, tribal leaders, and investigative journalists have died in accidents in the last 30 years? The number that emerged from their preliminary search was staggering. 47 deaths and disappearances of people who had been investigating mining operations on tribal lands, spanning 3 decades and 12 states. "This isn't just about uranium," Rodriguez said, studying the data. "Look at the geographic distribution. They are targeting any mineral resources on indigenous lands, uranium, lithium, rare earth elements, even oil and gas." Sarah felt sick. "We're not just looking at one conspiracy. We're looking at a systematic campaign of cultural genocide driven by corporate greed." Agent Martinez was on her phone, calling for additional federal resources. "We're going to need a joint task force, DEA, EPA, Tribal Affairs and probably Interpol, if these mining companies have international operations." Rachel was staring at the map of mining operations, her expression haunted. "My father wasn't just killed because he opposed one project. He was killed because he figured out the entire system." "What do you mean?" "Look at the timeline. The Evergreen Development meeting in Aspen wasn't about approving the uranium project. It was about James Morrison presenting evidence that the consortium was systematically targeting tribal lands across the entire western United States." She pulled up scanned documents from her father's briefcase. "Here, a letter to the FBI dated 3 days before his death. I have uncovered evidence of a coordinated effort to seize indigenous lands for mining purposes through legal manipulation, economic coercion, and, when necessary, violence. The scope of this operation extends far beyond my company's involvement." He was going to blow the whistle on the entire network, Sarah realized, and they killed him for it. But they didn't kill the investigation, they co-opted it. Martinez looked confused. "What do you mean?" Rachel pulled up FBI case files from 1987. "Look who was assigned to investigate Flight 447, Agent Robert Klein, who left the Bureau 6 months later to start a private security firm, a firm that specialized in corporate asset protection, and was later acquired by Morrison, Klein and Associates," Marcus finished. the same law firm representing Hayes. The FBI agent who investigated my father's murder became part of the conspiracy he was trying to expose. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just fighting a corporate conspiracy. They were fighting a system that had infiltrated law enforcement, legal institutions, and government agencies at every level. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You've made some powerful enemies, Dr. Chen, but you've also made some unexpected allies. Check your email." She accessed her secure email account and found a message with an encrypted attachment. The sender was identified only as Deep Throat 2.0. "Someone's trying to contact me," she announced. "Don't open it," Martinez warned. "It could be a tracking virus." "Actually," Rachel said, "let me check it on an isolated system first." She transferred the email to a laptop that wasn't connected to any networks. The encrypted file contained video footage, surveillance cameras, phone recordings, and what appeared to be secret corporate meetings. "Holy shit," Rachel breathed. "This is current intelligence. Board meetings from last week, conference calls from yesterday." The videos showed executives from major mining corporations discussing strategies for managing the Morrison situation and controlling the narrative around tribal land disputes. More disturbing were recordings of government officials coordinating with corporate representatives. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a meeting timestamp. "This was recorded 4 hours after we found the wreckage. They were already planning countermeasures while we were still underwater." One video showed a conference room where a dozen people in expensive suits discussed eliminating problematic individuals and accelerating land acquisition timelines to complete projects before public attention intensified. "We need to identify these people," Martinez said. Rachel was already working on it, using facial recognition software and corporate databases. "Most of them are executives from companies we already suspected, but look at this man in the corner." She enhanced the image of a man in his 50s with silver hair and military bearing. "That's General Patricia Hawkins, retired Army Corps of Engineers. She's been approving mining permits and environmental waivers for the last decade." "Military-industrial complex meets corporate greed," Marcus said grimly. "No wonder they've been so effective." Sarah studied the videos more carefully. "These recordings, the quality is too good to be from hidden cameras. Someone with high-level access is feeding us this information. Someone inside the conspiracy who's decided to switch sides," Rodriguez agreed. Another email arrived with more encrypted files. This batch contained financial records showing money transfers, shell company structures, and Swiss bank account numbers. "Our mysterious ally is giving us everything," Rachel said, downloading the files. "Corporate structures, financial flows, political connections. This is a complete map of the conspiracy." Agent Martinez was making rapid phone calls, coordinating with federal agencies and international law enforcement. "We're going to need to move fast. If they realize how much intelligence has been compromised, they'll start destroying evidence and eliminating loose ends." "Including us," Marcus pointed out. As if summoned by his words, the house's security system activated. Red lights flashed, and an automated voice announced, "Perimeter breach, multiple contacts approaching from north and east." Agent Martinez drew her weapon. "Everyone stay low. We have federal backup en route, but—" She was interrupted by the sound of helicopters overhead. Through the reinforced windows, Sarah could see searchlights sweeping the neighborhood. "That's not federal backup," Martinez said grimly. "Federal aircraft don't operate without transponders, and our radar shows these birds are running dark." Rachel was frantically uploading files to secure servers around the world. "If we don't survive this, at least the evidence will." The sound of vehicles surrounded the house. Sarah counted at least 6 engines, plus the helicopters. Whoever was coming for them had serious resources. "Dr. Chen," Martinez said, "I need you to understand something. What you discovered in that lake has triggered something much bigger than any of us anticipated. This conspiracy goes to the highest levels of government and corporate power. Are you saying we can't trust federal law enforcement? I'm saying we can't trust anyone until we know how deep this goes. The lights went out, plunging the safe house into darkness. Emergency lighting activated, casting eerie red shadows across the room. They're jamming our communications, Martinez reported. No cell service, no internet, no contact with outside agencies. Through the windows, Sarah could see figures in tactical gear moving through the yard. These weren't local police or federal agents. They moved with military precision and carried equipment she didn't recognize. "Rachel," she said urgently, "how much of the evidence did you upload?" "About 60%. The financial records and corporate structures are secure, but the video files are too large." An explosion rocked the house, shattering windows and throwing everyone to the floor. Sarah's ears rang as she struggled to her feet, tasting blood and smoke. "Gas masks!" Martinez shouted, pulling equipment from an emergency kit. "They're using some kind of incapacitating agent." Sarah could smell something sweet and chemical in the air. Her vision began to blur as she struggled to put on the gas mask Martinez handed her. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his military training taking over. "Back exit now!" But as they moved toward the rear of the house, more tactical figures appeared outside every window. They were completely surrounded. "This is Agent Martinez, FBI!" she shouted toward the main door. "You are attacking a federal safe house! Identify yourselves!" The response came in the form of more explosive charges, systematically destroying the house's defenses. Whoever was attacking had planned this operation carefully. Rachel grabbed Sarah's arm. "There's a tunnel. Cold War era leads to the neighbor's basement." She led them to a concealed panel in the floor of the kitchen. Below was a narrow concrete tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Go," Martinez ordered. "I'll hold them off as long as possible." "We're not leaving you," Sarah protested. "You have to. That evidence is more important than any of our lives. Get it to the media, to international authorities, to anyone who can't be bought or intimidated." As they dropped into the tunnel, Sarah heard gunfire above. Agent Martinez was making her final stand against overwhelming odds. The tunnel was cramped and dark, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through decades of dust and spider webs. Sarah could hear explosions and gunfire growing fainter behind them. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged in the basement of an abandoned house 3 blocks away. Rachel immediately activated a backup cell phone and began making encrypted calls. "We need extraction," she told someone on the other end. "Federal safe house compromised. Agent Martinez down. Full tactical assault by unknown forces." While Rachel coordinated their escape, Sarah tried to process what had just happened. They'd gone from discovering evidence of a 37-year-old conspiracy to being hunted by paramilitary forces in less than 12 hours. "Who has the resources for this kind of operation?" she asked Marcus. "Military contractors, intelligence agencies, or very well-funded corporate security firms," he replied. "The kind of people who can make federal agents disappear and cover it up as a training accident." Rachel finished her call. "We have a pickup in 20 minutes. But we need to assume that every federal agency, every law enforcement contact, and every official channel has been compromised. So who can we trust? International media, foreign intelligence services, and tribal governments. The conspiracy is powerful, but it's still primarily American. Other countries and sovereign tribal nations might be willing to help expose it. As they waited in the darkness for their extraction, Sarah realized that their investigation had crossed a line. They were no longer seeking justice for the victims of Flight 447. They were fighting for their own survival against forces that could manipulate government agencies and deploy military-grade assets. The war for the truth was just beginning, and they were massively outgunned. The fishing boat Maria Esperanza cut through choppy Pacific waters 40 nautical miles west of San Francisco, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the pre-dawn darkness. Below deck, in a cramped cabin that reeked of fish and diesel fuel, Sarah Chen hunched over a military-grade laptop, uploading encrypted files through a satellite uplink that bounced signals off servers in Iceland, Switzerland, and Singapore. It had been 72 hours since the attack on the FBI safe house. 72 hours of moving through underground networks that Rachel Morrison had spent years cultivating. Environmental activists, tribal rights lawyers, investigative journalists, and federal agents who'd grown suspicious of their own agencies. Marcus Thompson sat in the corner, cleaning a pistol that their latest contact had provided. The events of the past 3 days had triggered something deep in his military training. He no longer jumped at every sound, but he watched every shadow with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. Detective Lisa Rodriguez worked at a second laptop, cross-referencing the intelligence they'd received from their mysterious Deep Throat 2.0 source, with international databases of missing persons, unexplained accidents, and suspicious deaths. The pattern that emerged was staggering in scope. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, turning her screen toward the others. "I've found connections between our uranium conspiracy and similar operations in Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Same corporate shell structures, same legal firms, same tactics." Rachel Morrison, who hadn't slept in 48 hours, looked up from her own research. "It's not just an American conspiracy. It's a multinational mining cartel that's been systematically targeting indigenous lands worldwide for decades." Sarah paused her uploading. "How is that possible? How do you coordinate something like this across multiple countries and legal systems?" "Money," Rachel said simply. "And the fact that mining companies have been consolidating for decades. Look at the ownership structures. Most major uranium mines worldwide are controlled by just 6 corporations. And those corporations share board members, investors, and legal representatives." She pulled up a complex diagram showing corporate interconnections. "It's like a hydra, cut off one head in America, and 6 more operate freely in other countries." The boat's captain, a weathered Filipina woman named Elena Castillo, climbed down from the wheelhouse. "We're approaching territorial waters," she announced. "Canadian Coast Guard will be in radio contact within the hour." Elena had been contacted through a network of indigenous activists that spanned from Alaska to Chile. Her fishing operation was legitimate, but she'd spent years helping environmental researchers document illegal mining activities in international waters. "The Canadians are willing to grant you asylum?" Sarah asked. "For now. But your government is already applying diplomatic pressure. They're claiming you're fugitives from a terrorism investigation." Marcus looked up from his weapon. "How long before that pressure becomes irresistible?" "Depends on how much evidence you can get to international media before political calculations change." Sarah returned to her laptop, working frantically to upload the remaining video files. The satellite connection was painfully slow, but each completed file represented insurance against the conspiracy's efforts to bury the truth. A new encrypted message appeared in her inbox from Deep Throat 2.0. "Situation escalating rapidly. Corporate leadership meeting in Geneva tomorrow. Full board of directors for all major mining companies. They're planning to accelerate operations worldwide before international scrutiny intensifies." The message included detailed intelligence about the Geneva meeting, location, attendees, security protocols, and most importantly, evidence that several government officials from multiple countries would be attending. "Our source is giving us real-time intelligence about a meeting that hasn't happened yet," Sarah observed. "Whoever this is has access to the highest levels of the conspiracy." Rachel studied the Geneva intelligence. "Look at the attendee list. It's not just mining executives. There are representatives from defense contractors, energy companies, and agricultural corporations." "What does agriculture have to do with uranium mining?" Rodriguez asked. "Water rights," Marcus said grimly. "Mining operations require massive amounts of water. If you control the mining, you can control water access for entire regions." Sarah felt the pieces clicking together. It's not just about uranium. It's about controlling every natural resource that indigenous communities depend on for survival. Elena called down from the wheelhouse. Canadian Coast Guard on radio. They're requesting permission to come aboard for inspection. 20 minutes later, 2 Canadian Coast Guard officers were examining their documents in the cramped cabin. The senior officer, Commander Patricia Walsh, reviewed their asylum applications with professional skepticism. Dr. Chen, the United States government is claiming you're involved in domestic terrorism and theft of classified materials. These are serious charges. Commander Walsh, Rachel interjected, we have evidence of a multinational conspiracy involving the murder of 47 people and the systematic theft of indigenous lands across multiple countries. We're not terrorists, we're witnesses. Walsh examined some of the documents they'd uploaded to the Canadian immigration system. These allegations are extraordinary. If true, they would represent one of the largest corporate crimes in modern history. Which is exactly why powerful people are trying to silence us, Sarah said. Walsh made a decision. You'll be granted temporary asylum pending investigation by Canadian federal authorities, but I need you to understand, if this evidence proves fabricated, you'll be returned to U.S. custody immediately. Understood. We just need time to get the truth to international authorities who can't be influenced by American corporate pressure. As the Coast Guard vessel departed, Elena changed course toward Vancouver. They would have perhaps 12 hours in Canadian waters before diplomatic pressure forced another move. Sarah's laptop chimed with another message from Deep Throat 2.0. Geneva meeting moved up, happening tonight. Emergency session called after your asylum request became known to consortium leadership. They're accelerating timeline for all operations. Daddy, the message included live security camera feeds from a luxury hotel in Geneva, showing executives arriving for an unscheduled meeting. Sarah recognized several faces from the videos they'd received earlier. They're panicking, Rachel observed, moving up a major meeting because we reached Canadian protection, which means we're having more impact than they expected, Rodriguez added. Marcus was studying the Geneva feeds. Look at the security presence. Those aren't hotel security guards. Those are military contractors, the same kind of people who attacked the FBI safe house. Sarah enhanced one of the video feeds, focusing on a group of men in expensive suits entering the hotel. One face made her blood freeze. That's Agent Martinez, she said, pointing to a woman walking alongside the corporate executives. The room fell silent. Agent Martinez, who they'd left fighting a desperate rearguard action at the safe house, was apparently alive and collaborating with the conspiracy they'd been fighting. She was working for them the entire time, Rachel said quietly. The FBI safe house, the federal protection, the investigation resources. It was all theater to monitor our progress and control the flow of information. Which means they know everything we've discovered, Marcus said. Every piece of evidence, every contact, every plan we've made. Rodriguez was pale. How long has the FBI been compromised? How many other investigations have been sabotaged from within? Sarah felt sick as the implications washed over her. Every federal agency contact, every law enforcement resource Rachel used, they were feeding intelligence back to the conspiracy. Eleanor's voice came from the wheelhouse. Incoming satellite call for Dr. Chen, encrypted channel. Sarah activated the secure communication system. A familiar voice filled the cabin. Agent Martinez, calling from Geneva. Dr. Chen, I think it's time we talked honestly. Sarah looked at her companions, then activated the speaker. Agent Martinez, enjoying Switzerland? Dr. Chen, you've caused considerable disruption to a very delicate operation. It's time to consider the bigger picture. The bigger picture where you betray your oath to protect and serve? Martinez's laugh was cold. Dr. Chen, what do you think the FBI's mission really is? We protect national security, and America's access to strategic mineral resources is absolutely essential to national security. Rachel leaned toward the microphone. Agent Martinez, This is Rachel Morrison. You've been investigating my father's murder for 3 years. Was any of it real? Ms. Morrison, your father's investigation was legitimate, but it was also limited in scope. You never understood what you were really uncovering. Enlighten us. Your father discovered one small part of a global resource management program that's been protecting American strategic interests for 50 years. The uranium project he opposed wasn't just about corporate profits. It was about ensuring that America has access to nuclear materials independent of foreign suppliers. Sarah felt a chill. You're saying the conspiracy is a government operation. I'm saying that sometimes the interests of government and industry align. When they do, individual concerns become secondary to national survival. Marcus spoke up. Agent Martinez, I served 3 tours in Vietnam fighting for my country. This isn't patriotism. This is fascism. Mr. Thompson, you fought in a war to prevent communist expansion. This is a war to prevent resource scarcity. Same principle, different battlefield. Rodriguez leaned forward. How many federal agents are part of this operation? Enough to ensure that America's strategic interests are protected. Dr. Chen, you've seen the evidence of international coordination. Do you really think the United States can afford to fall behind in the global competition for critical resources? Sarah looked at the Geneva video feeds, seeing American government officials meeting with foreign mining executives. You're not protecting American interests. You're protecting corporate profits while destroying indigenous communities. Dr. Chen, indigenous rights are a luxury we can't afford when national survival is at stake. Climate change, resource depletion, and international competition require difficult choices. Elena called down urgently, American naval vessels approaching, 2 destroyers and a submarine, moving fast. On the horizon, Sarah could see the distinctive silhouettes of U.S. Navy ships cutting through the water toward them. They were still in Canadian territorial waters, but that might not matter if the conspiracy had enough influence over both governments. Agent Martinez, Sarah said into the microphone, are you threatening us with military force? I'm offering you one final opportunity to join a program that's bigger than any individual investigation. The Geneva meeting isn't just about damage control. It's about expanding operations to meet growing global demand for strategic materials. Expanding how? Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, hundreds of indigenous communities sitting on resources that the developed world desperately needs. We can do this through legal channels, economic pressure and negotiation, or we can do it through more direct methods. Rachel's voice was steel. You're talking about global genocide for corporate profit. I'm talking about species survival. Climate change will kill billions of people unless we transition to clean energy. That requires uranium, lithium, rare earth elements, and other materials currently controlled by indigenous communities who lack the technology and resources to extract them efficiently. Sarah watched the American naval vessels closing the distance. And if we don't cooperate? Then you'll be returned to U.S. custody as fugitives from a terrorism investigation. Your evidence will be classified as state secrets, and the program will continue without interference. Elena appeared in the cabin doorway. Canadian Coast Guard is demanding the American ships leave territorial waters, but they're not responding to radio contact. Sarah made a decision. Agent Martinez, we need time to consider your offer. You have 30 minutes. After that, cooperation becomes involuntary. The connection ended. Sarah immediately began uploading the remaining files as fast as the satellite connection would allow. If they were captured, at least some evidence would survive in international databases. Elena, Rachel called toward the wheelhouse, how close are we to Vancouver? 2 hours at full speed, but those American ships will intercept us long before we reach port. Marcus was studying nautical charts. Is there anywhere else we can go? International waters? A third country's territory? Elena traced routes on the chart. Russian territorial waters are about 6 hours north. But that means crossing through American and Canadian patrol zones. Rodriguez looked up from her laptop. I've got contacts in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. If we can get evidence to them, they might be able to issue international arrest warrants that supersede American diplomatic pressure. Can we transmit the files directly? Not fast enough. The video evidence is too large for satellite upload, and we'd need hours of uninterrupted connection. Sarah realized they were trapped. American naval forces approaching from the south, limited satellite connectivity, and evidence too large to transmit before capture. They needed a different strategy. Deep Throat 2.0, she said suddenly. Our mysterious source. They've been feeding us intelligence from inside the conspiracy. Maybe they can help. She sent an urgent encrypted message. American naval forces closing in. Need extraction or alternative strategy? Can you assist? The response came immediately. Extraction impossible, but you can turn the tables. The Geneva meeting is being broadcast on secure corporate networks. If you can hack the feed and inject your evidence into their own communication system, you can expose them to their own board members simultaneously. How is that possible? I'm sending you network access codes and injection protocols. You'll have one chance when they go live for the global board meeting in 15 minutes. Sarah's laptop chimed with incoming technical data, complex network infiltration tools, and access codes that would allow them to hack into the conspiracy's own communication systems. This is beyond my technical abilities, Sarah admitted. Elena called down from the wheelhouse. My nephew Miguel is a computer security expert, works for the Canadian government, but he's here on the boat helping with navigation systems. A young man in his 20s appeared, introduced himself quickly, and immediately understood what they needed to do. Corporate network infiltration during a live broadcast. Difficult, but possible if the access codes are legitimate. He began working rapidly, connecting to the conspiracy's secure networks using the codes provided by Deep Throat 2.0. On his screen, they could see preparation for the Geneva meeting. Multiple video feeds from around the world as corporate executives and government officials joined the secure conference. There, Miguel said, pointing to a network node. When they go live globally, I can inject your video files directly into their broadcast stream. Every participant will see your evidence simultaneously. Sarah looked at her companions. If we do this, there's no going back. We'll be exposing the conspiracy to its own leadership, but we'll also be making ourselves permanent targets. Rachel nodded grimly. My father died trying to expose this. At least we can finish what he started. The American naval vessels were now visible on the horizon, approaching fast. Elena estimated they had maybe 10 minutes before being intercepted. Miguel's fingers flew over the keyboard as he prepared the network injection. I need you to select which files are most damaging. I can inject maybe 60 seconds of video before their security systems lock me out. Sarah chose the most devastating evidence, recordings of American government officials coordinating with mining executives, financial records showing bribes to federal agents, and most importantly, the list of 47 dead or missing activists, journalists, and tribal leaders. They're going live, Miguel announced. Geneva conference starting now. On his screen, they could see the conspiracy's own video feed. Dozens of powerful faces from around the world, including several they recognized from wanted lists and government directories. Injecting files now. For 60 seconds, the conspiracy's own secure network broadcast their crimes to their own leadership. Board members in Geneva, government officials in Washington, mining executives in Sydney and Johannesburg, all watching evidence of their own corruption and murder. The reaction was immediate. Shouting, disconnections, emergency calls. The carefully orchestrated meeting dissolved into chaos as participants realized their secure network had been compromised. But in those 60 seconds, the evidence had been recorded by multiple participants, copied to multiple servers, and witnessed by hundreds of the world's most powerful people. Eleanor called down urgently. American ships are demanding we stop engines and prepare for boarding. Canadian Coast Guard is moving to intercept, but the Americans aren't backing down. Sarah could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. Through the cabin windows, she saw military aircraft with American markings circling the fishing boat. "This is it," Marcus said, checking his weapon one final time. "Whatever happens, we don't let them take us alive. Too many people have died for this truth to be buried." But as the first American helicopter prepared to land on their deck, Sarah's laptop chimed with a message that changed everything. "This is Captain Elizabeth Warren, U.S. Navy. Dr. Chen, please respond on secure channel immediately." Sarah hesitated, then accepted the communication. The face that appeared on screen was a woman in her 50s wearing the uniform of a Navy captain. "Dr. Chen, I'm Captain Warren, commanding officer of the USS Portland. I'm here to inform you that as of 30 minutes ago, the President of the United States has ordered a complete investigation into allegations of federal agency corruption related to indigenous land rights and mining operations." Sarah stared at the screen. "I don't understand." "Dr. Chen, your network injection was successful beyond what you realize. That 60 seconds of evidence wasn't just seen by conspiracy members. It was recorded and immediately forwarded to the White House, Congress, and international law enforcement agencies by participants who were unaware of the criminal activities you documented. The helicopter that had been preparing to land suddenly banked away. The approaching destroyers changed course, moving to form a protective perimeter around the fishing boat rather than an intercept pattern." "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "how do we know this isn't another deception?" Captain Warren smiled grimly. "Because Agent Martinez and 14 other federal agents were arrested in Geneva 20 minutes ago. Because the President is giving a press conference in 1 hour announcing a joint international investigation. And because the person who's been feeding you intelligence as Deep Throat 2.0 is about to identify herself." The screen split and a second face appeared, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "Dr. Chen," the woman said, "I'm Deputy Director Catherine Hayes, FBI, and yes, I'm William Hayes's daughter. I've been working for 30 years to expose the conspiracy my father helped create." The Situation Room in the White House buzzed with controlled chaos as President Jennifer Walsh reviewed classified briefings that had arrived in the last 4 hours. On multiple screens around the room, she could see live feeds from Geneva, Vancouver, and FBI field offices across 12 states where simultaneous arrests were taking place. "Madam President," Deputy Director Catherine Hayes said from a secure video link aboard the USS Portland, "we've confirmed arrests of 43 individuals in 7 countries. The Geneva operation netted the entire board of directors for 3 major mining corporations, plus government officials from the United States, Canada, Australia, and South Africa." President Walsh rubbed her temples. In her 2 years in office, she'd dealt with international crises, economic disasters, and natural catastrophes. But nothing had prepared her for evidence that elements of her own government had been systematically murdering American citizens for corporate profit. "Deputy Director Hayes, I need to understand the scope of federal agency infiltration. How long has this been going on, and how deep does it go?" Catherine Hayes had spent the flight from Geneva to the Portland reviewing files she'd been secretly compiling for 3 decades. "Madam President, based on our investigation, the conspiracy began in the early 1970s as informal cooperation between mining companies and individual federal agents. By the 1990s, it had evolved into a systematic program involving multiple agencies. On screen, she displayed an organizational chart that made the president's blood run cold. EPA officials approving environmental waivers for mining operations. Bureau of Indian Affairs employees facilitating land transfers. FBI agents investigating and then burying cases involving activist deaths. At least 12 Department of Defense personnel providing military contractors for special operations. Secretary of Defense Michael Rodriguez leaned forward. Are you telling me we've had active military personnel participating in domestic assassination programs? Not active military, sir, but military contractors hired through black budget operations that were theoretically for overseas counterterrorism. The same companies, the same personnel, redirected to domestic targets. Attorney General Patricia Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen, was reviewing legal implications. Madam President, if these allegations are proven, we're looking at the largest criminal conspiracy in American history, potentially hundreds of federal employees involved in murder, conspiracy, and treason. President Walsh turned to the screen, showing the fishing boat Maria Esperanza, now safely within the protective perimeter of U.S. Navy vessels. Dr. Chen, you started this by investigating a 37-year-old plane crash. Did you have any idea what you were uncovering? Sarah Chen, still in the cramped cabin of the fishing boat, looked exhausted but determined. Madam President, we knew the crash was suspicious. We had no idea we were uncovering a systematic program of cultural genocide. Cultural genocide is a strong term, Dr. Chen. It was Rachel Morrison who answered. Madam President, the evidence shows coordinated efforts to eliminate indigenous land rights across multiple continents. 47 documented murders, hundreds of suspicious deaths, and the theft of millions of acres of tribal lands. If that's not genocide, what is? President Walsh had reviewed the preliminary evidence that morning. The scope was staggering. Not just in America, but coordinated operations in Canada, Australia, Brazil, and parts of Africa. Mining companies working with government officials to systematically eliminate indigenous communities that sat on valuable mineral deposits. Deputy Director Hayes, the president said, I need to know, how did you discover your father's involvement? And why didn't you report this sooner? Catherine Hayes's expression was haunted. Madam President, I discovered my father was involved when I was 25 years old, a new FBI agent investigating environmental crimes on tribal lands. I found evidence linking him to the 1987 plane crash, but when I reported it to my superiors, I was told the case was classified and transferred to counterterrorism duties. She paused, gathering herself. It took me 15 years to realize that my own agency was compromised. I spent the next 15 years building an independent case, using my position to document crimes while appearing to be a loyal agent. Why the dramatic revelation now? Why not continue gathering evidence? Because they were accelerating operations, Madam President. The climate change crisis has created urgency around critical mineral extraction. Indigenous communities that might have had decades to fight legal battles suddenly faced immediate elimination. Secretary of State Amanda Rodriguez joined the conversation via secure link from the United Nations in New York. Madam President, I'm getting reports from multiple countries. The evidence Dr. Chen broadcast has triggered investigations in at least 12 nations. This is becoming an international crisis. How so? The mining companies involved have operations on every continent. Government officials in multiple countries are being arrested. Tribal governments are demanding immediate United Nations intervention. And several countries are threatening to withdraw from mining treaties if we can't guarantee the corruption doesn't extend to international agreements. President Walsh realized the political implications were as massive as the criminal ones. Are we looking at the collapse of international mining agreements? Potentially, yes. But more immediately, we're looking at demands for massive reparations to indigenous communities, criminal prosecutions that could implicate sitting government officials, and the need to review decades of mining permits and land transfers. On the Portland, Dr. Sarah Chen was working with Navy technicians to upload the complete evidence archive to secure government servers. The fishing boat had been a convenient escape vessel, but now she needed the resources of the federal government to process the massive amount of intelligence they'd gathered. Marcus Thompson, finally able to relax after days of running, was debriefing with Navy intelligence officers about the paramilitary forces that had attacked the FBI safe house. His military experience was crucial in identifying the contractors and tracing their funding sources. Detective Lisa Rodriguez was working with federal prosecutors to build criminal cases. Her police experience with organized crime was invaluable in understanding the conspiracy's structure and identifying key figures for prosecution. But it was Rachel Morrison who provided the most crucial intelligence. 30 years of legal research had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of the conspiracy's operations, and she was now helping federal agencies understand the scope of crimes that needed investigation. "Madam President," Rachel said via video link, "I need you to understand that what we've exposed is just the American component of a global operation. The mining companies involved have similar relationships with government officials in every country where they operate." President Walsh was beginning to grasp the international implications. "Are you saying we need to coordinate with foreign governments to investigate their own officials?" "I'm saying we need to lead an international response, or individual countries will start protecting their own officials while throwing blame on the United States. We could end up being scapegoated for a global conspiracy." Secretary of State Rodriguez confirmed the concern. "Madam President, I'm already getting calls from foreign ministers claiming their citizens were coerced or misled by American mining companies. If we don't get ahead of this narrative, we'll bear disproportionate responsibility for crimes committed internationally." Attorney General Chen was working through legal complexities. "Madam President, from a domestic standpoint, we need to decide how to handle federal employees who may have committed crimes while believing they were protecting national security. Some of these people genuinely thought they were preventing resource scarcity that could threaten American survival. Are you suggesting we consider immunity deals? I'm suggesting we need to differentiate between people who were manipulated and people who were actively profiting from murder. Agent Martinez, for example, appears to have been genuinely convinced that the conspiracy was a legitimate national security operation." President Walsh turned back to the screen showing Dr. Chen. "Dr. Chen, you've had the most direct contact with the conspiracy's current leadership. In your assessment, how many of these people were true believers versus simple criminals?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Madam President, based on our interactions, I believe there were 3 categories of participants: true believers who thought they were protecting national security, opportunists who saw a chance for profit, and psychopaths who enjoyed the power to eliminate opposition. Which category was the most dangerous?" "The true believers, because they were willing to sacrifice anything for what they saw as the greater good. The opportunists could be bought or intimidated, but the true believers would die before compromising their mission." Marcus Thompson added, "Madam President, from a military perspective, the true believers are also the most likely to have contingency plans. If their primary operation is compromised, they'll activate backup plans that could be even more destructive." As if summoned by his words, Deputy Director Hayes's expression changed as she received an urgent message. "Madam President, we have a problem. We've lost contact with mining operations in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. All 3 sites went dark simultaneously about 20 minutes ago." Secretary of Defense Rodriguez was already mobilizing resources. "Madam President, I'm dispatching reconnaissance drones to those locations immediately." Within minutes, drone footage was streaming to the White House Situation Room. What they saw made everyone fall silent. The mining sites hadn't just gone dark, they'd been systematically destroyed. Explosions had collapsed mine shafts, destroyed equipment, and in at least one case appeared to have triggered environmental disasters involving contaminated water systems. "Jesus Christ," Attorney General Chen breathed. "They're destroying evidence?" "No," Rachel Morrison said grimly. They're implementing a scorched earth strategy. If they can't control the resources, they'll make sure no one else can access them either. President Walsh realized they were facing something far worse than a criminal conspiracy. How many mining sites are we talking about? How much environmental damage could they cause? Deputy Director Hayes was coordinating with multiple agencies. Madam President, there are at least 37 mining operations that were part of the consortium. If they're all rigged for destruction, she didn't need to finish. The environmental catastrophe alone could affect millions of people, not to mention the loss of strategic mineral resources that America genuinely needed. Do we have any way to contact the sites that haven't been destroyed yet? We're trying, but they're not responding to official communications. These sites were designed to operate independently of federal oversight. Secretary of Defense Rodriguez was tracking military assets. Madam President, I can have special forces teams at the remaining sites within hours. But if they're rigged for destruction, military intervention could trigger the very disasters we're trying to prevent. President Walsh felt the weight of impossible choices. Allow the destruction to continue and face massive environmental catastrophe, or intervene militarily and potentially trigger even worse disasters. It was Dr. Sarah Chen who provided a potential solution. Madam President, our mysterious source, Deputy Director Hayes, has been inside this conspiracy for 30 years. If anyone knows how to safely shut down these operations, it's her. Catherine Hayes nodded slowly. I do know the emergency protocols, but implementing them requires physical access to each site's control systems, and the people running those sites know I've been compromised. So we need a way to get you access without triggering their defensive measures, Marcus Thompson observed. Actually, Rachel Morrison said, an idea forming, we need a way to convince them that shutting down is in their own best interest. She pulled up intelligence about the remaining mining sites. These operations were always designed to maximize profit while minimizing exposure. The people running them aren't fanatical true believers. They're middle management trying to protect their own interests. What are you suggesting? We offer them immunity in exchange for cooperation. Not the leadership, but the operational personnel who can actually shut down the sites safely. Attorney General Chen was already considering the legal implications. It's possible. Limited immunity for cooperation in preventing environmental catastrophe, but we'd need to move fast before the leadership orders complete destruction of all sites. President Walsh made the decision. Do it. Draft immunity agreements for operational personnel at mining sites. Deputy Director Hayes, I need you to contact these people directly and offer them a way out. As federal agencies began implementing the emergency plan, Dr. Sarah Chen found herself in an unexpected position. The forensic investigator who had started by examining a decades-old plane crash was now advising the President of the United States on preventing environmental catastrophe and international crisis. Dr. Chen, President Walsh said, I want you to understand something. What you uncovered has changed American history. We'll be dealing with the consequences of this conspiracy for decades. Madam President, what about justice for the victims? The 47 people who died, the communities that lost their lands, the families that never knew the truth. That's exactly why we need to make sure this investigation succeeds completely. Half measures would dishonor their sacrifice. Over the next 6 hours, a complex operation unfolded across multiple states. Federal agents, working with operational personnel who had accepted immunity deals, successfully shut down 23 mining sites without triggering environmental disasters. 7 sites were destroyed by automated systems before they could be reached, causing significant but contained environmental damage. 3 sites remained problematic. Isolated operations in Alaska, Montana, and Utah, where personnel had refused to cooperate and implemented full defensive measures. Madam President, Secretary of Defense Rodriguez reported, the remaining sites are effectively under siege. We have special forces teams in position, but any attempt to breach their perimeters could trigger massive explosions that would contaminate water systems for thousands of square miles. It was approaching midnight when the final breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Castillo, the fishing boat captain who had helped Sarah's team escape to Canadian waters, contacted the White House with intelligence from her network of indigenous activists. Madam President, Elena said via secure video link, the 3 remaining sites are on tribal lands that were stolen through the original conspiracy. The tribal governments have legal jurisdiction and they're prepared to exercise it. What do you mean? Tribal police and federal marshals working together. The sites can't claim they're operating under federal authority if tribal governments formally revoke their permits and order evacuation. Within hours, tribal governments in Alaska, Montana, and Utah had issued emergency orders revoking mining permits and demanding immediate evacuation of operations on their lands. Federal marshals working with tribal police served the orders while special forces teams provided security. Faced with legitimate legal challenges rather than federal overreach, the operational personnel at the final 3 sites agreed to shut down safely rather than face prosecution for environmental terrorism. By dawn, all mining sites were secured, the environmental threats had been contained, and the most immediate crisis was over. But as President Walsh reviewed the night's operations, she realized this was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The evidence Dr. Sarah Chen had pulled from the bottom of Crystal Lake had exposed a conspiracy that would require years to fully investigate, prosecute, and remedy. Families would finally learn the truth about missing relatives. Indigenous communities would begin the long process of reclaiming stolen lands, and America would have to confront the fact that elements of its own government had participated in systematic atrocities for corporate profit. Dr. Chen, President Walsh said, as morning light filtered into the Situation Room, I want to thank you for your courage, but I also want to warn you, this investigation is far from over. The people we've arrested represent only the American component of a global network. There will be legal battles, political challenges, and quite possibly ongoing threats to your safety. Sarah Chen, still aboard the USS Portland but now heading toward San Francisco under full federal protection, nodded grimly. Madam President, 3 days ago, I was a forensic investigator looking into a decades-old plane crash. Now I'm apparently a key witness in the largest criminal conspiracy in American history. Are you prepared for what comes next? Sarah looked at her companions, Marcus Thompson, who had overcome his PTSD to become a crucial tactical advisor. Lisa Rodriguez, whose police instincts had been essential in understanding the conspiracy's structure. Rachel Morrison, whose 30 years of legal research had provided the foundation for everything they'd discovered. Madam President, Sarah said finally, we didn't choose this fight, but we're going to finish it. The International Criminal Court in The Hague had never seen a case of this magnitude. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the witness podium in the oak-paneled courtroom, facing a panel of judges from 12 nations and an audience that included representatives from 43 indigenous communities, families of murder victims, and journalists from around the world. Behind her, projected on massive screens, were the images she had photographed at the bottom of Crystal Lake. The preserved bodies of Flight 447's passengers, the bullet holes in the aircraft's hull, and the briefcase that had contained evidence of a conspiracy spanning 4 decades and 6 continents. Dr. Chen, Chief Prosecutor Elena Vasquez, said, "Please tell the court what you found at a depth of 180 meters in Crystal Lake, Colorado, on the morning of March 15th. Sarah had told this story dozens of times to FBI investigators, congressional committees, international tribunals, and grand juries in 7 countries. But each time, she felt the weight of 47 lives lost and hundreds of communities destroyed. Your Honor, we found evidence that Flight 447 was deliberately brought down to prevent James Morrison from exposing a systematic program of indigenous land theft and environmental destruction that continues to operate today. In the defendant's section, 18 individuals in expensive suits sat with their legal teams. Former FBI agent Maria Martinez, retired Senator William Hayes, mining executives from 3 continents, and government officials who had spent decades facilitating what prosecutors now called the largest organized crime syndicate in modern history. At the prosecution table, Rachel Morrison, now serving as Special Counsel for Indigenous Rights, organized evidence that filled 27 filing cabinets and required a dedicated server farm to store digitally. 30 years of legal research had culminated in this moment. Marcus Thompson sat in the witness gallery, his military decorations worn proudly for the first time in decades. The investigation had helped him confront his PTSD, and he now worked with federal agencies training investigators in underwater crime scene analysis. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, officially unretired and serving as senior investigator for the multinational task force, coordinated with law enforcement agencies in 15 countries to track down remaining conspiracy members and their assets. Dr. Chen, Prosecutor Vasquez continued, the defendants claim their actions were motivated by national security concerns and the need to secure strategic mineral resources. How do you respond to that defense? Sarah looked directly at the defendants. Your Honor, national security cannot justify systematic murder, environmental destruction, and cultural genocide. The conspiracy we uncovered was never about protecting America. It was about protecting corporate profits while destroying the communities that stood in their way. She gestured to the evidence displays. The financial records show that consortium members diverted billions of dollars meant for environmental cleanup and tribal compensation into personal accounts. This was theft, not patriotism. Defense attorney Jonathan Klein, ironically, a partner in the same firm that had represented the consortium for decades, stood to object. Your Honor, Dr. Chen is offering opinion testimony beyond her expertise as a forensic investigator. Chief Judge Patricia Santos, a respected jurist from Brazil whose own family had been affected by mining operations in the Amazon, overruled the objection. Dr. Chen's investigation uncovered the evidence upon which this entire case is built. The court will hear her analysis, Sarah continued. Your Honor, the most damning evidence isn't what we found in the lake. It's what we found in corporate communications seized during the arrests. Email threads discussing eliminating problematic individuals, budget line items for special operations, and performance bonuses paid to government officials based on the number of mining permits approved. She pulled up specific documents on the courtroom displays. Here, a message from Defendant Martinez to Defendant Hayes, dated last year. The Chen investigation is getting too close. Recommend implementing Protocol 7 for all witnesses. Protocol 7, according to documents we recovered, was the coded reference for assassination. The courtroom stirred. Even after 6 months of revelations, the casual discussion of murder in corporate communications shocked observers. Prosecutor Vasquez approached the evidence display. Dr. Chen, please explain to the court the scope of operations we discovered through your investigation. Sarah had prepared for this moment. Your Honor, the conspiracy operated mining extraction and land seizure programs on 6 continents. In North America, 312 indigenous communities lost land through legal manipulation, economic coercion, or direct violence. In South America, the number rises to over 800 communities. Africa, Asia, and Australia show similar patterns. She pulled up a global map showing mining operations connected to the conspiracy. The total area affected is approximately the size of Texas. The estimated mineral value extracted over 40 years exceeds $2 trillion. The amount paid in compensation to affected communities, less than $50 million. Judge Santos asked, Dr. Chen, how many deaths have been definitively linked to conspiracy operations? Your Honor, we have documented evidence for 47 murders in the United States, including the Flight 447 victims. Internationally, the number rises to over 300 documented cases, with approximately 2,000 additional deaths classified as suspicious but unverified. The weight of those numbers settled over the courtroom like a physical presence. Defense Attorney Klein attempted damage control. Your Honor, Dr. Chen's numbers combine confirmed cases with speculation and hearsay. Mr. Klein, Judge Santos replied icily, your client's own internal communications discuss eliminating problems and permanent solutions to tribal resistance. The court finds Dr. Chen's analysis both credible and conservative. Rachel Morrison approached the prosecution table. Your Honor, I'd like to present testimony from Catherine Hayes, former FBI Deputy Director and daughter of defendant William Hayes. Catherine Hayes took the witness stand, her federal agent bearing unchanged despite the personal cost of her testimony. For 30 years, she had lived a double life, appearing to serve the conspiracy while secretly documenting its crimes. Deputy Director Hayes, Rachel began, please tell the court why you decided to expose your own father's involvement in this conspiracy. Catherine's voice was steady but haunted. Ms. Morrison, I became an FBI agent to serve justice. When I discovered that my father was involved in the murder of your father and 46 other innocent people, I had a choice: protect my family or protect my oath. I chose justice. What was the personal cost of that choice? I've lived in constant fear for 30 years, fear that the conspiracy would discover my investigation, fear that they would eliminate me as they had eliminated so many others, and fear that I would never live to see justice for the victims. William Hayes, now 74, and facing life in prison, stood suddenly. Catherine, you don't understand what you've destroyed. Judge Santos banged her gavel. Mr. Hayes, you will remain seated. Your Honor, Hayes continued, ignoring his lawyer's frantic gestures, my daughter has destroyed a program that protected American strategic interests for 50 years. Climate change, resource scarcity, international competition. We did what was necessary to ensure American survival. Mr. Hayes, you will be silent or removed from this courtroom. You don't understand, Hayes shouted. China controls 90% of rare earth element production. Russia dominates uranium markets. We were securing resources that America needs to survive the 21st century. Security officers moved to restrain Hayes, but Judge Santos allowed him to continue for a moment. Mr. Hayes, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, and crimes against humanity. How do you justify these actions? Hayes looked directly at his daughter. Because individual lives don't matter when civilization itself is at stake. Catherine, you've condemned America to resource dependency on hostile nations. Catherine Hayes stood and faced her father. Dad, you convinced yourself that murder was patriotism, but what you really created was a criminal empire that destroyed communities while enriching yourself and your partners. She turned to the court. Your Honor, the financial records show that my father personally received over $50 million in payments from mining companies over 40 years. This was never about national security. It was about personal greed. Hayes slumped back into his chair, the weight of his crimes and his daughter's testimony finally breaking his defiant facade. Prosecutor Vasquez called her final witness, Elena Castillo, the fishing boat captain whose indigenous activist network had helped expose the conspiracy's global scope. Ms. Castillo, Vasquez began, please tell the court about the impact of mining operations on indigenous communities worldwide. Eleanor, wearing traditional Filipina dress mixed with modern professional attire, spoke with quiet dignity. "Your Honor, the defendants claim they were securing resources for civilization. But they were destroying civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, before mining companies were even imagined." She gestured to representatives from affected communities who filled the courtroom gallery. These people represent cultures, languages, and knowledge systems that took millennia to develop. The defendants eliminated them for profit, claiming it was necessary for progress. What would justice look like for these communities? Your Honor, justice requires three things: punishment for the criminals, return of stolen lands, and resources to rebuild what was destroyed. Communities that lost their land need it back. Families that lost relatives need the truth. Cultures that were nearly destroyed need support to survive and heal. Eleanor paused, looking directly at the defendants. But most importantly, the world needs to know that indigenous rights are human rights. What happened to us can never be allowed to happen again. After 3 days of testimony, closing arguments began. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were patriots who made difficult decisions to protect national security. They claimed that mining operations provided essential resources and economic development to remote communities. Prosecutor Vasquez's rebuttal was devastating. "Your Honor, the defendants ask us to believe that murdering children makes communities safer, that poisoning water sources promotes economic development, that destroying thousand-year-old cultures protects civilization." She gestured to the evidence that covered the courtroom walls. "The evidence shows that this conspiracy was never about national security. It was about personal enrichment through systematic criminal activity. The defendants are not patriots. They are international criminals who wrapped their greed in a flag." Rachel Morrison delivered the final prosecution argument, speaking not just as a lawyer, but as the daughter of a murder victim. "Your Honor, my father died because he grew a conscience. He realized that the project he had helped create was fundamentally evil, and he tried to stop it. For that act of moral courage, he and 46 innocent people were murdered." She looked at each defendant in turn. These individuals had dozens of opportunities over 4 decades to choose justice over profit, truth over conspiracy, humanity over greed. At every decision point, they chose personal enrichment over human decency. The question before this court isn't whether the defendants committed these crimes. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether the international community will hold them accountable, or whether we will accept that powerful people can commit mass murder with impunity. The judges deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, Chief Judge Santos addressed a packed courtroom that included victims' families, indigenous representatives, government officials, and international media. The court finds that the evidence presented demonstrates a systematic multi-decade conspiracy involving government officials and corporate executives from multiple nations. This conspiracy resulted in hundreds of murders, the theft of millions of acres of indigenous lands, and environmental damage that will affect communities for generations. She looked directly at the defendants. The court rejects the defense argument that national security considerations justify these actions. National security cannot be achieved through the systematic violation of human rights and international law. Furthermore, the financial evidence clearly demonstrates that the primary motivation for these crimes was personal enrichment, not patriotic duty. Judge Santos announced the verdicts. Guilty on all counts for all 18 defendants. Sentences ranged from 25 years to life in prison, with additional requirements for restitution to affected communities. But the legal proceedings were only part of the story's resolution. 3 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood on the shore of Crystal Lake, watching as a memorial ceremony honored the victims of Flight 447. Families who had waited 37 years for answers finally had the truth. even though it was more horrifying than they had imagined. Marcus Thompson spoke at the ceremony, representing military veterans who had been manipulated by the conspiracy. The real patriots, he said, are the people who died defending their communities against criminals wearing the flag. Detective Lisa Rodriguez announced the creation of an international task force dedicated to investigating suspicious deaths of indigenous activists and environmental defenders. "We'll never know how many people were murdered by this conspiracy," she said, "but we'll make sure it never happens again." Rachel Morrison had been appointed as the first director of the International Indigenous Rights Tribunal, with authority to investigate land theft and environmental crimes across borders. Her 30-year quest for justice had evolved into a global mandate to protect vulnerable communities. Most importantly, indigenous communities began the long process of reclaiming stolen lands and rebuilding destroyed cultures. The conspiracy's assets, billions of dollars in mining profits and equipment, were being redistributed to affected communities as reparations. Elena Castillo had become an international spokesperson for indigenous rights, using her fishing boat as a mobile platform for documenting environmental crimes and helping communities connect across traditional boundaries. Catherine Hayes had resigned from the FBI and joined the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, tasked with investigating how federal agencies had been compromised. Her insider knowledge was crucial in identifying other government officials who had been corrupted or manipulated. As Sarah watched the memorial ceremony, she reflected on how a routine forensic investigation had exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in modern history. The evidence she had pulled from the bottom of a frozen lake had triggered a global reckoning with decades of injustice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Chen, this is investigative journalist Maria Santos. We've discovered evidence of similar mining conspiracies in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Would you be interested in consulting on our investigation?" Sarah smiled as she typed her response. "When do we start?" The truth about Flight 447 and the uranium conspiracy had been exposed. The criminals had been punished and justice had been served. But around the world, other communities were still fighting for their lands, their rights, and their survival against powerful interests that prioritized profit over human dignity. Dr. Sarah Chen had become more than a forensic investigator. She had become a voice for truth in a world that too often preferred comfortable lies to difficult realities. The work was far from over, but for the first time in decades, justice seemed possible. As the sun set over Crystal Lake, Sarah made a promise to the victims of Flight 447 and all the communities that had been destroyed by greed and corruption. The truth would continue to be told, no matter how deep it was buried or how powerful the people trying to hide it. The cold waters of Crystal Lake had preserved more than evidence. They had preserved hope that justice could still prevail, even after 37 years of waiting.